Well, welcome everyone to our panel discussion on designing carbon-free buildings. This is the first in a series of discussions on what it will take to build the path to 2050 in carbon-free buildings. And my name is Fernando Arias, and I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion as Clark's Director of Sustainability. And I'd also like to present to you my co-host for today's session, Teresa Backus, the Associate Director at the Building Innovation Hub.
Thanks, Fernando. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Building Innovation Hub and my colleague, Lindsay Falaska, the Director of the Hub, another big thank you to Fernando and Clark Construction and to all of our panelists here today. We also want to thank everyone who is in attendance. As you know, we're at a critical juncture in time for our planet, our country, and for the District of Columbia, and so we're very excited for this conversation. You may or may not know that buildings account for over 70% of the district's carbon emissions. So we need to address these building-related emissions in order to achieve our climate goals. And the Building Innovation Hub was created with the support from DC's Department of Energy and the Environment, as well as the support of our founding members like Clark Construction, to help us realize those goals through some key actions. First, connecting members of the DC real estate community to one another. Second, fostering these critical conversations around how various subsections of the industry can really work together to comply with the district's building energy performance standards. And third, making high performance buildings the new normal in the industry and really helping people to realize the benefits of high performance buildings. So traditionally, as I'm sure you have experienced, the various roles that affect a building's design, construction, and operations can be segmented. So the Hub is focused on connecting all sectors in order to help you understand how these roles interact to create best-in-class buildings. And when I say best-in-class, I don't just mean in the traditional sense, but it includes energy efficiency, resilience, health, equity over the entire building life cycle, really as foundational principles. So we act as a hub of information and connection, hence our name, for all parties, offering a full suite of online and hopefully in person soon resources, as well as events like this one that bring together industry leaders to share ideas and best practices. And as I said before, we're really at a moment of unique opportunity. There's growing awareness of the role that buildings play in climate action and in our health and communities. So let's get to work to make the most of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I think that was a really important overview and helps us really set the context. And so now I'm going to pivot to discussing our format for today, and expect about 45 minutes of discussion where I will moderate our panel and guide us through a conversation about what it'll take to design carbon-free buildings. And then about 20 minutes of Q&A will follow thereafter, so feel free to include in the chat any questions that might come up during the conversation today, and then certainly during the Q&A, we'll have the opportunity to unmute microphones and allow folks to jump in with questions and dialogue. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and present you with our selected panel today. My esteemed colleagues are now joining us. And so I'd love for you all to meet Arathi Gowda. So Arathi, please introduce yourself and say hello.
Hi everyone, I'm Arathi Gowda. I'm a team leader for SOM's High Performance Design Group, based out of our Chicago office, and my group is tasked with fostering sustainability and climate action in our global architecture and engineering practice. I'm also adjunct faculty at IIT, where last year I taught a studio titled The Green Line New Deal, which is centered on an equitable transition to a carbon-free economy. Fernando asked us to share a fun fact. I'm substituting that for a shameless plug. So I'm on the steering committee for the U.S. Architects Declare, and this is a network of architects also expanding to engineers and contractors for the Clark team out there. And this is also looking at addressing the triple threat of the climate, biodiversity, and justice emergency. and how, as a stronger network, we can work together on these complex issues. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion with like-minded colleagues. I think Annika is going next.
Yes, thank you, Arthi. Annika, say hello.
Hi, I'm Annika Landrenau. I'm the Sustainable Design Director for HOK. So I lead our 2030 commitment, our high performance design efforts, and in addition to setting inspirational examples by doing net zero, net positive design, I also work really hard to raise the floor, if you will, by working on codes and policy and advocacy. And so I do that locally in Washington, D.C., by serving on the Energy and Green Codes tag. I also serve on the Mayor's Green Building Advisory Council and the Building Energy Performance Standard Task Force. I work across the United States on model codes through the IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code Development Committee, as well as the American Institute of Architects Codes and Standards Committee, and now the Government and Advocacy Committee. I also, maybe a year and a half ago or so, was able to testify before Congress to the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and offer some of my ideas around solutions that might address some of our most pressing challenges through the built environment. And along with many of my other colleagues in the industry, those ideas made their way into the Biden platform and have started to make their way into some of the proposed legislation and stimulus packages. So it's really exciting to see that buildings are a part of the solution to hopefully our low carbon future.
Thank you, Annika. And then we'll come back and talk about our joint appointment on some of these committees during our conversation today. But now Melissa Wackerly would love for you to say hello.
Hi, I'm Melissa Wackerly. I'm with the American Institute of Architects as staff. I'm Senior Director of Sustainable Practice and Knowledge there. I've traditionally worked a lot with our energy and materials topic areas and making resources and education for architects to expand their knowledge and practice around those areas. I'm now working more on the climate action and design excellence side of things. 2 years ago, AIA prioritized climate action and last year added social equity and justice to our portfolio. So we are focusing quite a few of our resources, especially around the framework for design excellence and driving and zero carbon, equitable, healthy, and resilient built environment. We've done that with several ongoing programs and as well as some new ones, but the 2030 commitment is probably our flagship program whenever it comes to carbon reduction, and we just incorporated embodied carbon as a metric in that tool, so really excited about that. I'll also look forward to hearing to Tommy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. And then last but definitely not least, Dr. Tommy Zakraszewski.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Tommy Zakraszewski. I'm the Director of Building Engineering Physics at HKS, and that's where I lead the integration of optimizing the physical characteristics of buildings and their systems to balance energy demands, exploit natural energy sources, and minimize the reliance on carbon-based energy sources in primary practice. Additionally, I also help to create, advance, and manage annual environmental, social, and governance (ESG) objectives at HKS, key results, and action. I believe that a low-carbon future is forged by integrative architecture and engineering, and our purpose collectively, here today, is really to reimagine the built environment as an opportunity to be regenerative and adaptive for a more sustainable tomorrow. Outside my professional responsibilities, as with Arthi, I'm also an adjunct professor in the Department of Civil Architectural and Environmental Engineering at the Illinois Institute of Technology. This is one of the best joys of what I do professionally, but this is where I get to connect with students and begin to see some of the challenges we face as designers right now in the built environment, and providing that real-time feedback loop to better prepare students. Because that really, I think, is where we really need to seed some of the talent as we're trying to meet this climate crisis. Fun fact, as a testament to trying new things and doing things differently and stretching yourself and understanding something that you're not an expert in, education lesson, I helped develop and lead a prairie pollinator garden for my children's elementary school. And the whole purpose was to really help educate students around sustainability and biodiversity, something that they didn't have. So I thought that was a great project. Again, I'm not a landscape architect, But I was able to do that and learn from it. So I was happy to do that and share that with all the students in the community.
Do they call you Dr. Z at the school? Tommy?
All the time, all the time.
I love that. I love that. Well, as you can see from this great esteemed panel of speakers, there's just going to be a very dynamic and robust set of perspectives. And I offer just a very simple framework for our discussion today. We're going to talk about what are some of the opportunities, what are some of the challenges, and what kind of jobs we might need in order to realize designing carbon-free buildings. And the meta topic of our whole series, what will the future look like? What will it take to achieve carbon-free buildings by 2050? So with that, I will open up the question and invite the speakers to join in discussion together and respond to each other as we start the first topic, which is, what opportunities do you all see in the design contribution to carbon-free buildings?
I'll jump in here, Fernando. So I really think that the pathway to carbon-free buildings is really on the backbone of smart building design. So keeping equity and diversity in the forefront of smart building development has the potential to amplify its impact on carbon reductions, hands down. And when we talk about smart buildings, there's lots of definitions, but one that I like is something that uses both passive, the architecture, and the integrated active technologies, the guts, the mechanical electrical communication controls that reduce that bias within the built environment. And that creates more equitable spaces in buildings while working to reduce that climate impact of the building. So what is needed in design is that robust technology, that backbone that can really support the intelligent building analytics and property intelligent tools. With that in place, you have the flexibility to adapt your requirements and demographics, as well as track your performance in these areas. And that's the important key, is tracking performance. So having that infrastructure could support a lot of the right decision making that has to do with behavior, comfort, health, and well-being of the building, occupants, and stakeholders. And that's really important when we start taking that and scaling up into the context of ESG. So that smart building can then help facilitate transparent accounting needed for SGC reporting, especially with the environmental, the E in the ESG. And that's a company's impact on environmental ability to mitigate risk factors, ideally in real time. So being able to benchmark and measure and report all the primary and sub-metered energy within the building and then overlay that intelligence to optimize controls accelerates the ability for grid interactive efficiency buildings, right? So the Building Technologies Office, BTO, this is the Department of Energy, just published a national roadmap for grid interactive efficient buildings, GEBs. It's a new term that we need to use now. This roadmap defines technology attributes and integration considerations to achieving the full potential of adoption and deployment of GEBs. So these smart buildings need to adopt that mentality. And smart buildings are going to be the ones that be able to make the biggest impact as we move towards that carbon-free economy, because the connectivity and flexibility is the controls perspective. And it has that integration already within its building infrastructure. This is the passive and active system. So being able to measure, being able to respond, and interact with those grid responsive technologies.
I think one of our coolest design opportunities is going to be the investment in our existing building stack. I think the opportunity there is to save an enormous amount of embodied carbon by reusing the structure, the enclosure. In many cases, there's a lot of really great historic and cultural and contextual attributes about these existing buildings. I found that many of our deep green retrofits of existing buildings perform not only as well as, but often better than new construction. In part because they have a lower window to wall ratio. Maybe they were designed for natural ventilation or natural daylighting in an era before, the curtain wall and air conditioned building. But there's also the adaptive reuse. You get these really great details from a building that maybe, was a former power plant, or, we have a chicken coop. We have a chicken hatchery that was converted. You get these great details that you just can't make up for a new construction project. We did 2 World War II aircraft hangars in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, that were converted to a new facility for NOAA's regional center. And, there's just some details that you wouldn't design in a new project, but you get to capitalize on when you're doing an adaptive reuse project that make it just a unique place in the world. And so you can make these passive buildings, very low energy buildings, have significant reduction in operating energy and carbon emissions, but you get all of that embodied carbon reduction from that reuse. And often these buildings are also at the heart of existing communities with existing infrastructure, existing transit, and other factors that make them a great investment or reinvestment in those communities.
I'd like to add on that to that last note of Annika's, and that's, a lot of these buildings that she's referring to are blighted in many of these communities. So where you can invest in that community and lift that whole community through engagement processes as you design to make sure that the building contributes to the community and responds to their needs as well as the needs of the owner. So now you're not only getting that embodied carbon, but you're also growing your economy and supporting communities that need investment. So it's such a great cascade of benefits.
And maybe I can just round this out. I think one of the things that all of you might have noticed from our backgrounds is we're helping project teams within our organizations, and Melissa is an umbrella organization, a membership organization that really is helping guide, perhaps in programs like the AIA 2030 and some of the material transparency efforts. And that's a unique challenge in our positions that we're asked to guide project teams, but it's also a unique opportunity. I think the solutions, again, to the climate crisis are largely known. So we know what the carbon wedges and the reduction strategies are, but people often feel inertia within SOM and any of our particular organizations because the path is not fully mapped out. It's non-linear, and particularly as Annika had nicely outlined around embodied carbon. And so one of the things that all of us have been thinking about is really how do we take the lessons learned from this operational carbon puzzle that is much more clear to us than it was 10 years ago and apply it to embodied carbon. So as we think about whole life decarbonization, we get there much faster. And I think the lessons learned in that, the opportunity is that we really do need to support our colleagues like Melissa that are helping us on the forefront of policy and legislation move through transparency very quickly and benchmarking and get to legislation. So I think one of the things that I have found as an opportunity within SOM is really the design side of our practice is wholly optimistic around this. And we do have that opportunity to envision a more positive future. There's certainly a lot of fear around climate change. But as designers of the built environment, I think we can make things that are may seem largely unpalatable, like retreat or land access or some of these other things. We can rationalize that and also promote a very optimistic future as we adapt.
Yeah, Arathi, I'm so glad that you were also able to bring in an emphasis to the embodied carbon discussion, because comments that I heard from Tommy and from Annika really kind of marry or match up in the sense that there's existing buildings and new construction, and there are definitely opportunities to impact both of those portfolio classes of buildings. And I'd love to someday learn, what it will take to eventually renovate all of the existing building stock with an eye toward reducing extraneous carbon emissions that might be resulting from, different operations. So with that, I'd like to just dive a little bit more into the topic of embodied carbon. I think it's something that is very new to most folks. And one of the ways that we communicate about that here at Clark is we try to understand it from all of the carbon intensity that can occur during construction. But Melissa, I'm going to lean on your expertise and your background with building materials and open it up from there. But would love to hear more about how this set of folks is thinking about the upstream design opportunities to work with materials in innovative ways that have better outcomes for the carbon profile of materials, especially as there's a lot of controversy around EPDs and the validity of some EPDs to actually track carbon.
So just to note that even major renovation projects or adaptive reuse projects need new materials. So it's highly unlikely that any even renovation is going to happen without new materials being made and transported to the site, contributing to that embodied carbon piece. The AIA is looking at materials really holistically lately. So we've had a materials knowledge working group focused on materials since about 2014. And the culmination of our work right now over the years is a new A&D Architecture and Design Materials Pledge. And so that's a long-term vision of holistically sustainable materials that's evaluated in 5 different areas. So we have human health, ecosystem health, climate health, social health, and equity, all in a circular economy. So we still have a long way to go to see how we're going to measure to get to all 5 of those things. But what we're looking at immediately is that embodied carbon is one of the most actionable things we can do right now. And there's a lot of new innovative products that are out there. So where can we really lean into low carbon products or carbon sequestering products? There's carbon sequestering cement out there already. There's all kinds of low carbon materials, but a lot of our materials palettes are, really highly intensive processes in order to, have those assemblies and individual materials. So, we really want to look at, where we can have the most impact. And we can't do that on our own. We have to do that in conjunction with our manufacturers, with our contractors, with our owners. And so we want to have a vision towards where we can go. So that's kind of where we are with the materials pledge.
Melissa, I'll jump on that conversation. Really, we're building faster than we can mitigate or respond to environmental harm associated with it. Right? We're outpacing what the planet can take care of. And despite the pandemic, this is recent news, the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere hit a record high, as reported. So scientists from Scripps and NOAA report on Monday that the levels of carbon dioxide peaked in May and reached an average value of 419 parts per million. That's the highest measurement since the measurements began at those facilities 63 years ago. So we know that buildings are responsible for around 40% of global emissions, 29 with operational, 11 with embodied. That's the sort of piece of the puzzle. And with that known, and the ppm levels that we're at right now, we expect to add like 2.5 trillion square feet of new floor area to the global building stock and doubling it by 2060. So that's basically equivalent of adding an entire New York City every month for 40 years. That's pretty profound in terms of the impact. So think about the operational embodied carbon, how the buildings are consuming energy and fuel, what's the, embodied carbon or carbon associated with materials, and how that will need to be managed by our planet. Guess what? It can't. Right? We put it out of balance already and keep tipping the scales. So that's why this new building stock, or what's the challenge that's in front of us, that we really need to think about designing to meet net zero carbon standards. And the way that we've been doing it as an industry as a whole is we deliver designs that meet minimum code requirements, and specifically energy code requirements. So if you zoom specifically in the United States, the energy code adoption looks like a memory quilt. It's just a patchwork of mismatched fabric. DOE tracks this across all commercial and residential buildings. What we need more of are building energy performance standards like Teresa mentioned for DC. There's other ones, New York City, Washington State, St. Louis, and Montgomery County that has, yes, energy efficiency performance standards, but we need the embodied carbon to be part of that, right? We're not going to see likely a code develop its way. It's going to be on the back of these performance standards. We have energy already in place, but we need that embodied carbon to really balance out that pie and that development that's going to come at us in the next 40 years.
I think that they say the greenest building is the one you don't build, and I think the greenest material is the one that you don't use or you use less of. And so part of this discussion is, and we're talking about design here, designing to optimize the materials you do have to build with. So it's great to get carbon sequestering materials, but it's also great to design to use less materials overall. And so as a designer, it's like, can we optimize the structural grid? So when we're talking about operating emissions, the architect should be working with a mechanical engineer to reduce peak loads so that we can right-size the mechanical system, right? When we're talking about building materials, it's like, let's optimize the grid so that I need less steel, less concrete, right? I know projects where we've reduced 15, 20% or more material just by working on the right span, so that we don't need, these massive columns or beams, that we can reduce the quantity of material overall. Then you optimize the material itself. Cement replacement, carbon sequestering aggregate, carbon sequestering concrete, certified responsible steel. So we need to use less material. And that's before you even get to, salvage materials or timber or anything else. It's also important to note there's no silver bullet. We're not going to carbon sequestering cement or concrete or timber our way out of this problem. And even a timber building has concrete and steel, right? We can't solve our problem with any single material. So that's important. We do need to focus on multidisciplinary integrated design, just like we had to do all those years when we've been focusing on operating emissions. We have to do it with embodied carbon too. Those best practices are still best practices. And then, Tommy talked about smart buildings. We have to be smart when we design for ease of reconfiguration, right? And the ability to leverage our tools like BIM. How am I going to reconfigure this building again and again and again and again? And how do I design so that I can do that without having to tear down and demolish and rebuild and just throw more and more materials in the landfill and extract more and more materials to replace it? So we can design smart buildings that leverage technology and design and technology and operations in order to reduce our reliance on virgin materials and reduce our embodied carbon emissions. And to, the point about the codes, I do think we're moving in the direction of an integrated embodied carbon and operating carbon emissions code. I don't think it's going to happen right away. I think, like Marin County has embodied carbon in its code. We're seeing some spot counties or cities, jurisdictions that are going to adopt an embodied carbon code. But ultimately, I think we're going to have to see those two things marry so that you get a carbon budget for your building. And that's it. Like, you can decide if it goes in the materials or it goes into the operations, a little bit more here, a little bit less here, but that's all you get. And so that will help incentivize the reuse of existing buildings, the preservation of existing buildings. If you do new construction, though, you get a lot less. You're going to have a regenerative building, a net positive building, because you put all your carbon into the materials.
Somehow I became the anchor on a very detailed conversation where everyone did well. But what I would say, I think the challenge, as everyone is outlining too, is that we are trying to get ahead of something that is not legislated. It's not required. And I think one of the things we're all challenging ourselves to, both as professionals and even as we teach, first we have to train a generation to help us do this. And every time we have a meeting about, for instance, life cycle costs, we have to talk about carbon. So we've started embedding the social cost of carbon as an outlay in this. So a low and a high cost, it is going to mean that all of these strategies that don't pay back now are going to pay back sooner. And one of the problems is, of course, the cost of carbon is completely externalized. So we keep trying to make this argument for something that doesn't pay, but the seed of it is really to start talking to your clients about it, because as Tommy was mentioning with ESG, if we can't get them on one side, everyone else is making climate pledges too. It's not just us, it's the people that we're working with, the institutions we're working with. And so they are seeing that value. Even as we ask that question in SOM, I can see them saying, hey, we've never seen this before. Nobody ever presented this to us. So I do challenge everyone in the audience to think, just as I do to other teachers, did you have a class or did you have a client meeting where you talked about carbon and all of these topics we're talking about, reducing the hot spots? What's the inflection point of looking at the embodied carbon of a fin versus the operational savings that you're going to glean from that? And is that happening in the point where we're actually needing to bend the carbon curve? So the reason we're looking at zeroing out by 2030 is these are huge inflection points that if we miss them, we really don't want to think about what's going to happen when we're going to miss them. So I think part of it is for all of us to just keep putting it out there. It is difficult. We're trying to get ahead of something that isn't there yet. But I think in climate optimism, as we're seeing, this has been decades in the making. And all of a sudden the dominoes tip very quickly. And for those who aren't paying attention, it seems like, oh my gosh, everything's changing really quickly. But for those of us in the sustainability space, it's like, oh, we've been working on this. Our mentors, the people in our network are all doing that. And I think this next 5-10 years is going to be very exciting in that regard. So we should prepare for it, and we should prepare our clients to hear that language.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed the full depth of the discussion, because as you were all speaking, I was thinking, for example, Melissa's comments earlier about economic development, community development, and enabling some of these communities that might be experiencing blight conditions to also thrive as part of the overall growth. It made me start to think as well about the importance of looking at this giant unknown of embodied carbon in a more practical way, which is local materials. One way that we can begin to reduce the carbon burden, the carbon intensity of materials, is to just think about the regionality and the availability. And remembering now that spot prices on materials is very volatile, just shortening the distances of those materials being delivered and potentially extracted as well goes greatly toward the reduction of the carbon intensity. So I think that there's a lot that we could do there, both, Annika, from the perspective of using less materials with more impact and with more delight, as well as thinking about where can we propagate some novelties in the regions where we obtain materials from, because then that definitely would help to reduce on the carbon intensity of the material.
Fernando?
Yeah, please.
So I think that there's a really important connection there to this idea of a circular economy. So where are we reusing materials instead of creating new materials? How do we repurpose not only existing buildings, but existing, building materials? When you demo an office floor, there's lots of doors usually, and with newer open office floor plans, now you may not have as many doors. So how can you have some secondary marketplace for those? Those secondary marketplaces are ripe for economic development, for local economic development, and where you can see new businesses grow and prosper. So now you have a secondary market with existing building materials supplementing the new material market, which is, right now cost is crazy. So any materials right now are helpful. But we really don't have that secondary market in place with consistency. There's a few little pockets that have some nonprofit organizations or something, or architectural salvage stores, but it's not scaled to the level that we really need for the level of building that's going to be decades.
Right. And see, I think for me, I would say it's a nice way of segueing into the next set of conversation, which is really thinking about the challenges. What are some of the challenges that you all see in designing carbon-free buildings?
I'm going to just jump this off because I think when Tommy talked about the smart building, I think it's a critical component, but so much of a growing portion of building energy consumption is occupant behavior and plug loads. And we can't totally monitor and meter and control our way out of it. It's the human element, because human beings will undermine every effort that we make to make, carbon efficient, energy efficient buildings. And so we have to figure out how to design spaces that engage the occupants or the users in the process of being efficient, right? They have to understand how this building works, how it functions, and be a part of it, be an active participant in it, or it's not going to work. We do need that real-time feedback. We do need to monitor and meter and measure and control. But people need to be able to read a building. And right now, if you go into any major city downtown and you walk around one of the buildings, it looks the same on every side. How do people read a building and understand how it's responding to the environment when the north side looks the same as the south side, looks the same as the west side, looks the same as the east side? They don't understand how buildings interact with or relate to the environment. So how can we ask them to participate in this process when we're not designing for it. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges, that we need to do a better job first so that they understand how the building works and then they can participate.
I'm going to build a little bit on what Annika just said, and that behavior is a really big component of making this happen. You know, we've known for a long time about building performance simulation tools. We've known about iterative design processes. But what we see in our surveys of our members is that, you know, people just aren't using them necessarily. So with AIA, you know, kind of trying to bring that profession to the level that can respond to the climate action issues that we need to, you know, it's getting people engaged in how to design more iteratively with, you know, simulation tools that can be scientific. How can you maximize passive strategies, which goes to exactly what Annika was saying about orienting to the climate. You know, if people understand that they're a part of nature and the building responds to nature, then they're going to be more engaged.
I mean, I do think, again, the challenge that I've seen across my career, which now is almost 20 years, is there is this growing cohort of people, and you know, sustainability is a discipline. We're all in the discipline of sustainability, and I kind of joke and say we're making our own discipline. We have specific, I would say, professional degrees. We've learned a lot more on the job, but in any of the industry organizations I'm in, you know, part of the conversation will be, well, you're at SOM. SOM has a ton of resources. I'm in a small firm. Melissa was alluding to that a little bit. But I think the reality, whether you're a big, medium, or small firm, is there are not that many resources on sustainability. You know, we're small crews compared to the size of our firm. A lot of what we're doing is around education and helping every project architect, every project engineer understand how they can embed this into their practice. And obviously that's what Fernando is doing in the construction field. So we're seeing counterparts in the construction field. I think, you know, the real challenge is that everybody understands what we understand. We level up more because every day we're learning more information that's making us smarter about how we design better for a more sustainable future. I think we can imagine, obviously, in this next 10, 20 years, as we're trying to very fast and efficiently decarbonize, there isn't one discipline, even outside of AEC, that's not going to be thinking deeply about decarbonizing the entire economy. So I think it's to take that inertia that some people feel that someone else is taking care of this, and help everyone realize that in our work, in the way we behave, where we put our dollars in terms of investing, and even consumer goods, all of that has to look at this fundamental problem. I think if you look at this panel, everyone here is like going to scrape for an extra 5% of decarbonization on their project. We will just like fight and come back to the client. We need everyone to have that same mentality, and I think that's the real challenge. How do you get people to do that? And I think, in a sense, it's how do you make everyone an activist? Because there's a certain mentality around it. People are like, I'm so drained after they hear no for the first time. But that's not what you hear from people in sustainability, because that's what we do every day. We get up and we kind of get drained. But we are very, I would say, optimistic and also almost recharged by that, right? So we have that mentality that you're going to get up and fight every day. So to me, that's the big challenge, to get everyone to think that way, that a setback isn't really a setback. It's just part of this opportunity to change our economy and change the way we think about sustainability.
Yeah, that's totally right. There's not enough of us, right? You know, carbon is that common denominator that should be understood by all stakeholders in design, right? That's what we should be fighting for. There's a problem with people not understanding the immediacy of carbon, right? We're concerned more about, you know, cryptocurrency and security, you know, issues that we've been seeing in the news. And the 419 parts per, you know, billion carbon number doesn't even make a blip in the news. It's not that common vernacular that everyone is fighting for, that has that activist in them to really drive that carbon-free economy. And that really starts when we think about design and the challenges is if we don't talk about that and make it measurable during those early design charrettes, we're bringing everyone in together to really talk about what is this building going to do, not only from the energy side, but from the community, from the social, from equity to carbon, all those things that I think, if we look at frameworks, the, AIA framework for design excellence is something that beautifully captures the impact of design. And a lot of the common denominators in those categories are carbon. So the more we talk about it, the more that we can level set, the more that we can move forward with really mitigating that environmental harm that we're doing.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the way that we are exploring the challenges, because part of what I also am hearing through, especially out of these comments around activism, advocacy, certainly we would professionalize that and call it advisory services. I think that many of the client conversations that I'm certainly involved in are currently centered on the ROI, right? What is the return on this investment? Why should we embark on this? Apart from being, leading edge, differentiated types of clients, there isn't really clarity around the targets and the clear standardization across a portfolio. And certainly, like Annika's comments, some of this might be really appropriate for workplace and commercial buildings. But as we are now seeing as well with the return to the new normal now, there's a shift in workplace dynamics and workplace behaviors with more working from home. And so we haven't really even begun to translate these conversations to mid and low scale buildings, right? So with that, I want to just queue up one moment here on the conversation for Annika, because of your expertise, Annika, with the building energy performance standards and the task force, the committee that you and I are serving on with the Green Building Advisory Council here in DC. When we start to think about applying a target or a standard across building, different types of building classes and building sizes, what are some of the conversations you're hearing in those groups regarding maybe some of the challenges to operationalizing some of these policies here locally in DC?
Well, just when we were looking at the building energy performance standard, talking from some of the, portfolio owners, with the shutdown from COVID, folks who owned, REITs and other organizations who own lots of office buildings and multifamily buildings and everything, they noted generally office buildings with good, controls, good building automation systems, the ability to turn down their buildings, saw at least a 40% savings, but they still had to operate their buildings. They had to worry about dehumidification, so there was still some mechanical loads. Maybe there was partial occupancy. There were a lot of people I know with my organization doing remote desktoping, so we still had our computers operating in the office, and all the heat output from that, and then of course the cooling loads from that. And so we weren't just, hey, turn off the office and move on, right? And so you had that challenge, but what they thought was really interesting is the residential buildings, the multifamily residential buildings, really weren't using any more energy, even though people were suddenly all working from home. And that should tell us something, that our residential buildings are not turning down when we normally would go to the office every day. We're not saving any energy on a normal basis when we all leave our residential buildings normally when we're not in the middle of the pandemic. So we got a lot of opportunity in multifamily buildings, certainly with how they're operated, plug loads, heating and cooling, lots of opportunity there. But the challenges certainly with just transparency and benchmarking, collecting data, from a multifamily building, from all of those individual building owners or tenants. Affordable housing, it was a big challenge, both in New York, we had to look at how they handle that in DC. And not just affordable housing, but lots of low income or other populations that might not have the revenue stream to be able to address their existing building. Yet you don't want them to end up with the only buildings that haven't been improved through this cycle. You don't want them to have the worst buildings, in town, right? And so how do we make sure that we can come up with improvement plans and funding so that the best buildings, the most comfortable thermally, the best indoor air quality, the best resiliency in a power outage, with the best thermal envelope, the best energy security and affordable energy bills, all of those things we're hoping to get out of our legislation that address existing buildings, that goes to the most vulnerable members of our community, because we know that our terrible existing building stock is partially responsible for the poor health platform that led to so many members of our communities being susceptible to the worst impacts of COVID. So those are some of the challenges we've got to address, is making sure that we get the targeted outcomes we're looking for when we do pass legislation like transparency and building performance standards.
Anyone want to jump in on the conversation around this nexus between policy, market-based approaches, private sector adoption of some of these approaches?
I think Annika said it well, and I'll just leave it at a sentence or two. But I mean, it really is time for us to be advocates. And I think all of us are, whether it's at the state, local, and federal level. I think the AIA, ASHRAE are really getting in on this with good reason. Again, we've been very quiet for decades, I would say. AIA has not been quiet, but we're getting louder in this area of climate action. Even Chicago is looking at an omnibus this summer at the state and city level. Tommy's been involved in that as well, since we both hail from Chicago. And this idea of having a just transition is absolutely critical. And I've been saying this even on calls because we are scared of the word reparations in this country. I feel we will never get there, even though we should be there. And so for those of us who are intelligent and not scared of that kind of word, to use this as a pivot point in terms of justice, if we think of World War II, where people got a house, but it was only vets who were of a certain color that got a house. We know who that is. Why isn't the just transition actually BIPOC communities? And I think that's something that we can all clearly fight for, as we advocate for legislation.
Any final thoughts before we start to talk a little bit, perhaps, about a theme that I'm very excited about, really, which is under the premise of economic empowerment. I wanted to really use these last few minutes of our discussion to talk about the jobs and the way in which value creation can start at the grassroots level, really, when we think about vulnerable communities and equity permeating through to everyone. Certainly would love to hear your thoughts together about what kind of jobs from the design community, perhaps, do we want to start to look at as we pivot into this next sort of carbon-free economy?
I'll jump in first. I think what's really interesting and exciting is to see the growth that's going to happen on the top and bottom in our industry. On the top, I'm really referring to most of the climate activists here and elsewhere. Our role in design firm has to eventually evolve into becoming chief sustainability officers in a wide gambit of corporations, so that we can again drive that discussion forward about carbon. It's sort of this graduating role that we have to transition from the designing into the actual policy making. So that's a sort of an opportunity of growth on the top. But on the bottom side, how we start thinking about preparing the next generation of designers and construction professionals and scientists who make materials, that's really going to have to be done on the higher ed side. And you heard Arthi and I are adjunct professors because we recognize that we need to seed that education earlier in higher education design, so they can be better prepared to execute all the things that we're confronted with right now. But many times, universities are doing sustainability degrees or engineering or architecture degrees in a haphazard way. They're really just plugging in some bits of sustainability, but I haven't seen a program that's really centered around carbon and the built environment that students coming right out of school are ready to execute. I mean, there are programs like at Columbia University that they now have a whole climate college that's really centered around policy making, education, around all things carbon, which is really great. But universally speaking, I think the education system needs a little bit of an uplift to prepare those ready to execute those positions at the chief sustainability officer level, or coming in right into the beginning of the design and really executing the things we need.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
You were talking about jobs, and I think, Melissa mentioned simulation being such an important part of design and making sure that we can anticipate design outcomes. And certainly in this era of transparency and building performance standards, it's increasingly important that we communicate throughout the design process to our clients what the anticipated outcome of our design decisions are. It's also now in our code of ethics that we will set meaningful targets for performance and carbon emissions with our clients and talk about the impact of our design on the environment and the environment on our built environment. And so we need simulation tools in order to do that. But I think, using those tools isn't just about energy metrics or carbon metrics. It's about the experiential value of design. And I find increasingly we're not designing daylight just to quantify, spatial daylight autonomy. It's, is this good daylight? Are we creating glare conditions that will be uncomfortable for people in the space? Thermal discomfort and visual discomfort. Are we creating a comfortable environment with, natural ventilation or other design characteristics that we're seeking to employ in this building? So energy performance is important and carbon reduction is important, but this space has to be comfortable. And I personally don't think we should be handing out design awards if you go a year after that building was delivered and all the shades are down because we've created such an uncomfortable environment for people. And I was on a tour of an award-winning building. And people walked in the building and all started taking off their jackets and their clothes because it was so hot in there with the solar heat gain that they literally started, like business people at a business conference were stripping their clothes off and putting sunglasses on. That is a failure of design. And so we have the tools at our disposal to do a much better job anticipating how that building will respond to the environment and interact with the environment. And I think, there's a reason why that can't be part of the designer's role, but there can be specialists. In the same way we have medical planners and lab planners, we can have people who specialize in that deep simulation work to make sure that we are fine-tuning our design so that it is comfortable and enjoyable and there is a delight in being in those spaces. So.
Yeah, when we frame that for our members, we try to frame it as look at all the amazing things that design can do. Look at all the cool stuff that simulation opens to you. And it's so exciting. And so I think that we've been in kind of a rut, or we had been for many years of this like finger wagging, you must do this because it's important. And it is important. And everyone on this call is, an activist, as Arati said. But not everyone can necessarily or wants to necessarily be an activist, but pretty much most, I would say most, if not all, AIA members are interested in good design and having great design tools and having, things that they can talk to their clients about the value of the design. And so even if you use the example that Annika said, which is the glare issue, you can talk about the value of the space on the users. You can talk about the value of the building in the community, and you can frame it in ways that the client connects to the values that they have for the project. Because whatever you do, climate action is going to affect everything. Like, it's not a small thing. So if you can take the things that are important to your client and apply the values of, the design that they're trying to achieve, and it also, operates efficiently, or uses less carbon, but you have more character in your building, it's a win-win.
Yeah, and we do have some really excellent questions coming in. So for all of the wonderful participants that are still with us, I promise that we're definitely going to touch on those. I'd love to hear some of Aarti's thoughts on this opportunity to have jobs be a component of the solution. I'll offer my final thoughts, and then we'll pivot right to some of these fantastic questions.
Sure. I mean, I think everyone has said this pretty well, that our work, there is a lot of work to do between connecting the role of simulation and the deep building science and engineering to the livability, the storytelling. So we haven't been very good as an industry. We've been kind of geeks in a corner. We're not very geeky on this call, but there's a reason why this role, science communicator, around climate science has become a role title. We have to be communicators and amplifying kind of the positive benefits of all this work. I think in terms of jobs, there's a very clear job bump that's happening in our profession and the profession of sustainability. Building scientist roles, green certifications, ESG, all of this is bumping. I think there's also an opportunity that's equitable, that, the Green New Deal, there's a reason why my studio has the Green Line New Deal, and the Green Line is a train line in Chicago. That is really trying to connect equity with climate action. And again, for us, I know Fernando thinks about this too. One of the biggest things that we can do as we think about embodied carbon is really think about supply chain and the labor. I think a colleague in the sustainability space said to me at a committee level several years ago, but every one of our projects probably has slave labor on it somewhere in the supply chain. So for us to think about that in terms of equity is really important. And I think embodied carbon and the call for transparency around the emissions, supply chain, and labor is something that we can do on every one of our projects. And we also see that with legislation like the Green New Deal, in Illinois, like the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which is looking at about 15 incubators throughout the state that prioritize low-income business owners to become the new providers of solar and wind, right? So for us to support that in the construction industry, and construction has always been a pathway, I think, for people to enter middle class, working and building. This is a talk I give at SOM, who builds our projects, right? And it's an amazing collection of people. They look very diverse, very different. And I think all of us on this call support that and continue to support that in our work. It's really critical.
Yeah, that's very fair. And I think that's a way that also helps me connect some dots, especially personally, as I think about one idea that I've been thinking through, which is the associate architect community, myself being one. There is an opportunity for the associate AIA credential or the title to provide contributions, solutions, advocacy, a variety of these differentiators in a design team on the path to licensure or otherwise. And I would love to see more engagement with the associate AIA community as a technician role, or a role that helps to fill some gaps here in practice, since we are in the design conversation. And I know that there are many credentials out there in the marketplace related to green building certifications, to knowledge base credentials. So there's a few ways that folks can signal their knowledge base and their specialty. So with that, I think it would be a great way to now segue into some of our questions. And so I wanted to start with one that was really interesting. It's going to hark us back to the original start of the conversation around opportunities. And so question came through that's asking, refrigerants used in heat pump systems aren't talked about much. This is a recognized source of lost carbon that directly affects the atmosphere when released during installation and repair. Would you put refrigerants in the embodied or operational category, and what can we do about it?
Yikes, the refrigerant question. That's a really good question. As I was listening to it, I was really trying to think, where does it sit? Operationally may make the most sense because that refrigerant, again, if it leaks, yeah, it's doing some considerable environmental harm. But from the embodied side, that's what you put in day one, right? So there's a carbon value to it immediately. I think the solution maybe is, I know ASHRAE does a lot of work on this, but alternative, more natural refrigerants, right? I've seen some really interesting ground-coupled heat pumps that use CO2 as a refrigerant. So that's almost taking care of all the hesitation of putting in a refrigerant, but using carbon, it could be a sink within the system. So inevitably, I think it's leaning on operational carbon rather than embodied, but something, again, you can most definitely evaluate when you start benchmarking or evaluating embodied carbon of a building through LCA.
Also highlight that the drawdown organization listed refrigerants as number one impact. So it's a huge issue. I think that there's also a lot of opportunity for innovation in mixing natural ventilation with mechanical ventilation. That's not something that's really done right now. As somebody who is currently in a hot and humid climate with broken air conditioning, I can totally relate to how it would be wonderful to have a more economically, efficient system. It also came out with the pandemic, because ventilation was a huge issue in the pandemic. And as you increase ventilation, there's a trade-off on operational energy that's really not being evaluated in the same way as the human health aspects of the pandemic right now. So if we could combine those things, then we could have better health outcomes and we could have potentially better efficiency outcomes.
And it's more resilient if you have a loss of power, passive survivability, the ability to open windows and not rely on mechanical ventilation is, I think, important. And you can, even in I grew up in Houston, believe me, I know hot heat and humidity, but you can, with, air movement, ceiling fans, you can be comfortable for many months of the year without air conditioning. And, I recognize when it was a new innovation, it seemed really neat. But, we need to build up our tolerance to a variety of conditions. And it shouldn't be, 70, 65, dry, still air all the time. And in fact, we actually make a lot of people uncomfortable with air conditioning, right? This sort of constant condition indoors, which doesn't match the outdoor condition, makes more people uncomfortable, I think, sometimes than not. So we have to think about that. But yeah, there are other ways of addressing conditioning. We have that project I mentioned, the World War II aircraft hangars that we did for NOAA. We did a deep sea well we did our chiller plant and used that with the trade winds to basically cool the air, and that helped with dehumidification, and then use underfloor air to distribute it, through convection. Use computational fluid dynamics to do our simulation to make sure everyone got air distributed through the space. It was an ARIA Cook Top 10 award winner, so we appreciate the Framework of Design Excellence for driving a comprehensive approach to sustainability. But there are ways, you don't always have those opportunities, but the point is to look for what opportunities you do have in your site and your context, and they look different everywhere you go, but there's always opportunities to design for place.
Now I am going to, Aditi, sorry, finish your thought, and then I wanted to ask one more question. It seems like we may run out of time today, so there are a lot of other questions that we may not get to, but there's going to be report outs and takeaways from today's session that we do look to fulfill all of the questions that were asked. So for all of the attendees that are here today, stand by for receiving that after today's session as well. But Aditi, finish your thought, and then we'll have one more question.
I'm trying to jump in, but I mean, this one is huge too. With, I think, the lack of full ratification on the Kigali Protocol. So it was one of the last things that Obama tried to do in office, was to get this passed, knowing that it's such a huge impact. We are seeing with increases in code an increase in heat pump and VRF. So it is a cost-effective way to get there, and these are very refrigerant heavy. So if you look at something like the LEED system, you increase your optimized energy, you can't hit the refrigerant management. What we're seeing in other parts of the world, just as Tommy had mentioned, is ammonia-based in Europe or CO2.